Professor John Donaldson is a full-time lecturer at Singapore Management University. His qualifications have seen him gotten a PhD in political science, a BA in Chinese language and literature and psychology. His research interests mostly dwell into decentralization, local politics, Chinese politics, poverty, and politics in developing countries. His latest research is of great interest, and especially to me, in which he has studied the ever controversial Malay gap. In this interview with him, I set out three goals. One is to understand what the 200-page report basically says about the current development of the Malay communities in Singapore. Two, to have discussions regarding the broader aspects and ideas of why they may find themselves in the positions that they are. And three, to offer pushback and also criticism to the study that he had been commissioned for by the AMP. I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you. So, hi everybody. I'm with Professor John Donaldson. He is one of the authors of the report Dreams Realized, Dreams Deferred, which is looking at understanding and addressing the racial gap in educational achievement in Singapore. So, Professor John, um, shall we go through the report, maybe theme by theme, and pick out the most obvious ones that kind of stand out in terms of your results and the findings?
Sure.
So, in regards to, I guess, the first theme, which is motivation and the Malay problem, it seems like, well, like most of the findings that we've gotten, the typical stereotypical belief of like the problems with the Malay race don't seem to hold true when it comes to testing out the hypothesis.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we were actually not, we were originally motivated by kind of a different question, which is REMA was and AMP, larger at large was, they had been spending a long time focusing on how do you help Malay students avoid or get out of the normal tech stream, which is the lowest, not the lowest, but anyway, the lowest formal stream here in Singapore.
Yeah.
And they felt like they had a pretty good handle on that. But what they didn't know is what happens to people who stayed in the stream and what caused success and what caused failure. And there's a whole bunch of things we can talk about that, like how do you even measure what success is and all of that. They were interested in the Malays because that's what their organization does. But in order to do that, we had to look at the entire range. And we were mainly looking at low income people. And so whether it's Chinese, Indian, Malay, we were interviewing low income people. But in doing so, we were able to get a rich set of interviews from more than 100 respondents. And we would spend 1 to 2 hours talking to these folks. And we discovered we could also answer a whole bunch of other questions, or at least weigh in on a whole bunch of other questions. And one of the things, you notice, as I've lived in Singapore now for about 16 years, is that there's a stereotype about Malay people, and it's not just that the Chinese majority holds these stereotypes. Many Malay also hold these stereotypes, and the puzzle is, why are Malays, basically, not basically, but since independence, why are they in the lowest strata in terms of economics and education? And one of the main hypotheses about that is that they don't work hard. And it was labeled, the Malay problem, that there's something. And then there's different strains of this. There's basically 3 strains of this. And one is biological. Actually, Malays by biology are unmotivated. Some people say it's by culture, that they're what do you call it? They're influencing themselves, and the culture kind of spreads that way. And the third is a lot more sympathetic. It's more like the Malays are not tied into the Chinese majority's values of, doctor, lawyer means success, and make as much money as you possibly can means success. It's about having a good family and a good life and a good religious life and all of that kind of stuff. But irrespective of the source, the conclusion is the same, that you would find that that Malays would be what do you call it, unmotivated, and also that they would not have an aspiration or a material kind of aspiration. And you would expect that to be especially true with students in normal tech stream, right? But not in SMU, but in normal tech stream. And so what we found was that we interviewed people, we're interviewing adults, but when they look back at their childhood, many of them said, yeah, I didn't study very hard.
Yeah.
That's one of the ways, not the only way, but it's one of the ways to do badly on the PSLE is to not study. But what we discovered is that the majority of the folks that we talked to in terms of normal tech were not studying very hard, but it was spread out among the races. There were, basically proportional to the numbers of people we talked to, Chinese and Malays. And so there wasn't anything inherent about the Malays. Many of the people that we talked to who weren't studying because they were playing. And, in the West, we think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Children playing is a good thing. But in
Like children be
Singapore,
children.
yeah, right. Let children be children. You have to work, but it's kind of like you ramp it up and all of that kind of stuff, and that you actually learn more by playing and stuff like that. But in Singapore, if you're not studying by age 6 or 7, you're in really big trouble.
Yeah.
And so that was part of it. But some of them had, family
Issues.
disruption, family trauma, other kinds of things that would impede them from studying. Some of them were smart, but they had trouble with what we might call book smart. And so they were hands-on learners, and all of that kind of stuff. But no matter, irrespective of the issue, you did have a good chunk of people who were studying really hard and still didn't pass the PSLEs. And they did well enough to get into normal tech, but not well enough to get into normal CAT. But then you had a lot of people who weren't studying. And the first point is that it was spread among the Malays and the non-Malays. And so it's nothing inherent with the Malays. And the second is that most of the people, be it Chinese or Malay or Indian, most of the people that weren't studying as kids were focused and engaged later on in life.
Okay.
And so it's not like it's something inherently cultural or biological. It can change. And part of it was that some people got kind of this aha moment where they discovered who they were and what they wanted to be. Might have happened later in life. Some of them, it happened actually in ITE because they were hands-on learners. And then when they got to ITE, they were starting to do things that they were actually good at. And the instructors there were encouraging and all of that kind of stuff. Some of it happened in the world of work. But so, and so the second lesson is that even if a kid isn't focused by the PSLE time, it doesn't mean that's fixed, that that people can get inspired later on in life. Sorry, long answer to your short question.
For sure. But I do have a couple questions to follow up with. So firstly, it seems under one of the tables, we were classifying these students if under various categories, such as, if they were consistently lacking in determination, which was the Malay stereotype, consistently determined, subsequently determined, so on and so forth. So how would these measures sort of collaborated with the students in question? Because these measures seem to be quite subjective. Was there like an objective measure of like, oh, we looked at how many hours they studied, or was everything quite kind of self-reported and we just took the word of the student? Yeah.
It's a really good question. Sorry to interrupt your question. It's a really good question. And people, I think there's two ways to answer it. And the first way, I'll just tell you what we did, which is that if there is something to the Malay stereotype, or even something to the idea that normal tech students, forget about Malay Chinese, are lazy, then you would expect them to be consistently lazy. And that was the kind of the never motivated, or never, I forgot what the table says, but never engaged or never determined or whatever, right?
Yes.
And that was, I think, about a quarter of our sample, something like that, right? And then some were always focused. And then some were not focused early on, but focused on later.
Mm.
And how do we find that out? Our methodology, the way that we're collecting our data is through interviewing. And there's this kind of a stereotype that, or not stereotype, but kind of a misconception that anything quantitative, anything numbers is objective, and anything that's sort of spoken or a story is subjective.
Yeah.
And the truth is they're both. You're talking to adults who are trying to remember back when they were kids.
Mm.
So even if you ask them how many hours they studied and all of that kind of stuff, it's
It's not
all
going to
going
be
to be
accurate.
based on recall,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, and the thing is, if I ask someone, did you study as a kid, and they're trying to make themselves look good,
Recall
they would tell
bias.
you,
Personal
well, yeah,
bias.
they would tell you, yeah, I worked really, really hard.
Yeah.
And the truth is that most of our interviewees told us that they didn't study very hard.
Okay.
And so we got the sense that if they were really trying to make them, that we, yeah. And so we worked really hard in training our interviewers to develop this kind of level of trust, confidentiality, and all those kinds of things so that people would be authentic.
Mm.
And it was more like a conversation than it was like an interview or a survey or something like that. And so people basically, we had a list of questions, but people could kind of go wherever they wanted to go. And so we were convinced that they were, trying to give us an accurate portrayal of their own life. Now, if we went back in time machine, we might see something different. They said that they didn't study, but we saw that they actually did, or something like that. But that's, but if we actually quantified it, I'm not sure it would be any more accurate than,
Right.
asking them. So
Okay.
I wouldn't call it any more or less kind of objective simply because there's not a number attached to it.
I understand. I understand. Okay. Since we are on the topic of biological theories, then I guess I unfortunately have to bring up one which seems to come up a lot in certain debate spheres in Singapore. So some people might kind of justify the inequality in education and income between the races as being part of the IQ gap. They would say that there's an IQ deficiency in the Malays, and since IQ is one of the biggest predictor of success in life, hence da 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 da. You usually, obviously, this topic is really controversial because of all the race science and history behind it. But putting all that aside, um, was that not one of the things that the study would kind of look at or account for?
Well, okay, yeah, because here's the thing, we're looking at normal tech students, and we didn't administer IQ tests or anything like that. And so we actually are not able to get into the question of, are these people equally or less smart or whatever. And you say kind of put all this aside, but it's really difficult to actually do that, because from its history, the IQ has been biased
Right.
in many different ways.
Okay.
And it was originally normed on, middle class white people. And when I was in college, when I was in university, I was a psychology major, and I took a class called Black Psychology. And the teacher had actually established an IQ test that was normed on Black people.
Right. I
And
think the acronym for that, forgive me for sounding a little vulgar, but it is BITCH, if I'm not wrong, because I did read about the cultural biases of the IQ test. I'm
right,
trying to
right.
remember what the acronym really stands for, but
The
right?
Black intelligence test of cultural homogeneity. And so
Exactly.
that,
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
Professor Williams from, I bet he's retired by now, but anyway, he was my teacher when I was in undergrad. And so depending on how you norm it. And here's the other thing, the racial side of things. But the other is, let's say the A levels were about fixing an engine, a car engine. So you go in and you say, this car is broken, fix it. It would score people differently the A level does, right? It's a different kind of an aptitude test than than the standard A level, general paper and mother tongue and whatever other subjects you're taking. And a lot of the kids who end up being streamed into normal tech would do a lot better because they were hands-on learners. And so part of the issue also, and Singapore is grappling with this as well, is what is intelligence?
Hmm.
Are there many different pathways to success, and the different talents that we have, the different kinds of intelligence that we have, can we, so across the street from me is SOTA, right? School of the Arts. So if you're
Okay.
artistically inclined or
Yeah.
sports school or, that kind of thing, are we able to kind of identify the kids' aptitude and their interests and passions, and then match them with the kind of education that would be appropriate for them? So in many senses, maybe my kind of intelligence, my aptitude is not matching for ITE. I wouldn't necessarily do all that well, right? But does that mean I'm dumb?
Yeah.
I've got a PhD. So you know what I mean? A different kind of intelligence. But in terms of our research, we were not able to, we didn't have the data that could actually answer that question.
Very, very well. Okay.
By the way, I'm impressed that you've heard of that test.
Oh yeah, because I guess I do try to involve myself in quite a lot of discourse regarding social issues. So when people bring up the IQ test, I kind of laugh because there's some like huge limitations about it, like with the whole history of how they tested it around a lot of white people. It's kind of made for white people, so it would be obvious that certain races who were to be able to take it would kind of fall behind. And also seen studies where they've actually controlled for culture, and also for people who actually practice it like it was a test, they actually tended to do better. So it's like something you could really study for. It doesn't really sort of measure like total in inherent intelligence. And as you were mentioning yourself, intelligence can be defined in so many ways, right? We could be physically intelligent, artistically intelligent. There's just so many cognitive abilities, and it's a little unfair to put it down to one single factor. But moving on, the next category that you were looking at was peer influence. Were there any sort of discrepancies that you found in that one?
And that idea, you also hear this a lot, that Malays that hang out with Malays don't tend to do well.
Yeah.
Malays that hang out with Chinese don't tend to do better. And that it's essentially kind of a restatement of the Malay stereotype, but it's the cultural aspect of it, right? So if you hang out with people who are more motivated, and that may be true if you hang out with people who are more motivated, but does that map onto race? And in terms of our interviews, we also found no support for that kind of a hypothesis.
Right. Okay. In terms of Malay and maths, which was quite unique and quirky, I guess, category, but one that seems to be brought up a lot by especially Singaporean ministers in terms of the progress in especially that subject, which I guess has its practical implications in school and in work and in all the STEM courses, right? So yeah, maybe you
And
want
that's
to
also
yeah.
that's also been internalized in terms of Malays will often say that about themselves as well. And so that one we could test because we asked people how well they thought they did in math,
Yeah.
and also how well they actually did. And there's also very little evidence that again, with normal tech students, you're not going to have the high flyers in math because then they would pass the PSLEs. But many of them went on to vocations that would involve math, like accountancy or technical trades or other things like that. And then many of them express confidence in math, in their math skills. And so it's not that they kind of lacked. They may be good at math, but they lacked confidence in math, and that's what caused them to have problems. Uh, they did seem to be, you know, their degree of confidence also did not vary much by race.
Right. Okay. And then I guess moving on to parenting style. I guess this one would be one of the easier ones to kind of debunk in a sense that how could really like someone's parenting style affect their education outcome in such drastic measures, right? And also I guess another sort of hindrance to kind of really proving that would be I guess most parents wouldn't really have one fixed parenting style. I'm sure as the child develops, the parent might become less authoritarian in a sense or more. It
Right.
really depends, but yeah, I've seen that the statistic significance for this is really really low, and it doesn't really prove that whether you come from a authoritarian background or if your parents were permissive or neglectful, it had real no sort of effect on your educational outcome. It might be
Mhm.
slightly better if they were more controlling and more, I I guess strict with their children's, but it didn't really play a big role, did it, in the results?
Right. Yeah. And so this is a kind of a, it's a hypothesis that came out of the Western context. And the Western context is that, if you have sort of this warm, permissive environment, or even if you're hands off but warm. And so one is kind of you're leaning in and warm, the other one you're sort of permissive and kind of hands off but warm, that your kids will thrive. But if you're authoritarian, they won't do very well. And the criticism about that is that it's Western centric. And many people would say, well, the Chinese are successful because their parents are authoritarian.
Yeah.
They are strict and they do, what do you call it? Create structure where kids will sit down and study and all that kind of stuff. And that if you're permissive, it would actually be, a bad thing. And what we found is no matter what, the patterns didn't make sense. It wasn't like the Malay parents are more permissive or more authoritarian or anything like that. We found a range of parenting styles and a range of outcomes, and we didn't see much of a correlation in this in this sample, which is again low income normal tech grads.
Okay. And large family sizes, how did that play um a role into their educational outcomes? Because that as well doesn't really seem to be that statistically significant, which would be quite a shock because I would like normally assume based on the research that the report was going on and the previous citations that they had, it seems that having like a big family size would impact on the resources spent on per kid, as well as the, I guess, responsibilities that they have. But it's a lot more nuanced than that, right? It really depends. It doesn't mean that just because you come from a family of six that you perform necessarily worse than a family of two or three.
Yeah, and so the stereotype is that the Malays have more kids. Statistically, they do have
Yeah,
more kids,
yeah,
and in our sample as well, they did have more kids. So we did find that our Malay interviewees, they had more brothers and sisters than the other races. But you pointed out the logic is that, in terms of monetary resources, it gets spread too thin. And that's another subject that we look at, or even in terms of how much study space you have or how much time your parents have to spend with you and other things like that can get divided. But again, we found very little explanatory power in terms of that. The Malays had larger families, but we didn't find that having larger families necessarily led to a worse outcome.
right. I see. Okay. And in terms of juvenile delinquency, there wasn't much to be said about that as well. No.
Right. Well, we had here's where part of our, we didn't interview anybody in jail or,
Okay.
and so we had a bias sample, right? that it wasn't like we took a snapshot of Singaporean society, although very
Yeah.
few Singaporeans are in jail, but you get the idea that we had a few people who might be labeled a youth
At
at
risk.
risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And but anybody who had been to jail or there were a few that had been in deeper trouble. And you know, uh, again, it wasn't like that was all that tied to race. And so the stereotype that normal tech kids are all a bunch of misfits or youth at risk or things like that were also inconsistent with our findings. And that idea also being tied to race was also inconsistent with our findings.
I see. Okay. And obviously the next one would be talking more on low income households, which unfortunately Malays seem to be the dominant race.
Yeah,
How,
and
yeah,
that's right. All the statistics say that Singaporeans, just even in terms of seeing stats, that Malays have lower incomes on average
yeah,
than Chinese do. And in our sample, we were looking at low income people.
right.
But even within low income, there were different different stratas. And that on average, our sample, the Malays also had lower incomes, especially lower income per capita. And it's not that income didn't matter.
Mm.
It's that there were enough people who were able to overcome the limitations of income that, yeah. And so part of that, and one of our study's conclusions is that Singapore is actually quite generous in terms of financial
Oh,
assistance.
fair, yeah,
Yeah. And not in terms of welfare to poor families. It mainly hits in terms of welfare to poor students.
yeah,
And so textbooks and
correct.
other things like that.
I
And what we
believe,
found
yeah,
was,
sorry,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I believe that Mendaki, which is one of the Malay
Mhm.
organizations,
Yeah, yeah.
and
And so
other
through self-help,
community
right.
like
And so
groups.
some of that could be free tuition. I mean, free, tuition, what Singaporeans were, what in the West we call tutoring,
Yeah,
right? Or, other things like that. What we never found was that we found two or three things about this. One is that um, it was absolutely necessary
mm,
for almost everyone in our sample who got financial aid found it to be really helpful.
definitely.
But for almost nobody in our sample found it sufficient. In other words, financial aid by itself wasn't enough to allow people to achieve their dreams.
Right.
And so the message is that financial aid needs to continue, but we can't pretend like it's enough.
Mm,
Uh, that other kinds of interventions were also really important. And we can't conclude that income doesn't matter. But what we can conclude is that there are ways to help people overcome the limitations of low income. But the other issue that we had is that if we really wanted to study this issue, we needed to increase our sample to wealthier normal tech students.
mm,
And then we would see what are the advantages of being
right.
wealthy or middle class, but we were really only looking at
A
lower income.
homogeneous bunch.
Right, homogeneous bunch. But even amongst them, there was a lot of difference, right?
Right.
Desperately poor and all of that kind of stuff. And so to what extent were they able to overcome? And that's why I think you saw, but then the fourth point about this whole thing is that there were a lot of people who fell through the cracks.
Okay.
That, for good reason, welfare organizations, the government wants to make sure that the tax dollars are well spent.
Yeah.
But by enforcing strict rules, what that means sometimes is that people will fall through cracks. And oftentimes that's on the bureaucratic side. You're not
Right.
able to produce paperwork, or they assume, oh, you're brother has money, but my brother I haven't talked to in 20 years or whatever, the uncle or whatever, the extended family.
Yeah.
And then the other issue is that sometimes the parents are so stressed out or so neglectful that they don't have the wherewithal to even fill in the forms, that kind of thing.
I
And so
see.
the children suffer for that as well. And so there's a lot of people who fill in the crack and fall through the cracks in terms of the financial assistance.
Right. And I I think one of the questions that I have would be because of the cultural differences, religious as well, where I guess the males are kind of seen as the breadwinner and then the females are more of like the caregivers at home. I've seen this statistic as well, where I believe 50% of Malay Muslim households, the females, the wife basically does not work at all, and she stays at home to take the kids. She might partake in home-based businesses instead, and that
Mm.
obviously lowers the household incomes itself. That there is quite a deep inequality in that, as if you would compare into Chinese or Indian households as well. Could you think that so how if I was to phrase my question a bit better, like how would we then overcome this issue? Because it's quite tied into religious and cultural beliefs in that the females
Right.
shouldn't be out in the workforce, and even if they do, they would experience a lot more discrimination, i.e. the hijab issue, stuff like that. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. I mean, the first thought I have is that, let's be careful about vocabulary
Yeah.
because like I'm a parent and I can tell you parenting is work.
Hmm.
It's a lot of work. But what you're talking about is working outside the household for income, right? And so it's not like these women are just kind of sitting at home twiddling their thumbs.
Definitely
They're
no.
doing a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's yeah.
Unpaid
And
labor.
traditionally, in my culture, in Western culture, and in Singaporean, in Chinese culture, Indian culture, Malay culture, women didn't work 200 years ago, whatever, right? That wasn't, they wouldn't work outside the home. They wouldn't even dream of it. But with basically since independence, the economy was set up such that women really had to join the workforce, and um, in order to not survive, but in order to thrive, in order to make the household work, household economy work. It was part of the survival strategy and all of that kind of stuff. We can't, our data doesn't really speak to that issue at all, because the people that we're talking to, were young, and the vast majority of them were working, whether they were male or female. But also, very few of them had families by the time, right? Because normal tech is still a relatively new thing by design. I mean, by it's no accident that our sample was really young, 20s and 30s, right? And so we can't really speak to that. But there were a couple of issues in terms of gender that we did notice. And one is really interesting. It's that guys are actually overrepresented in normal tech,
Hmm. I
not
think it's
not
the
women.
same issue in America as well, where
Yeah.
I was looking at the high school dropouts and the rates of university and college completions. It seems that females are well in front of the males. There seem to be some social and also educational issues with
Right.
that. And I think that's going to snowball into quite a huge issue. But
Yep.
coming back to things of more relevance, I was basically talking to more of I guess the general idea that the inequality, because I would say that you and I would both agree that income plays a very big role. It 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 plays a significant role enough to affect your educational outcomes and your success in life. Um, so if we can establish that, and also the statistic that it's much higher in Malay households where where the females would not work to to stay at home and take care of the kids, or be partake in home-based businesses. Could that then explain the some sorts of inequality between the education gaps and income gaps in Singapore then?
Yeah, yeah, but it could, but this research can't speak to that
Okay.
because our sample is too young for that to be an issue. And in our sample, the vast majority of them were working, to or in NS, or what I mean, continuing their education or something like that. So we were talking to adults, but they were all young adults, so it really didn't hit our sample. But another thing to think about is that, NS, MINDEF, all of this kind of stuff, what is Singapore's number one national security issue is not Malaysia, it's not Indonesia, it's not the rise of China, it's not the wishy-washiness of America. It is that you're not reproducing yourselves. You're committing genocide on yourselves. That the birth rate is so low. And if you want to have more, if society, we want to have more kids, we need to figure out this issue of childcare. And if we want to figure out this issue of childcare, we also have to recognize that bringing in foreign domestic workers is, only second best. And we need to be able to think of some way that parents can really parent. At the same time, the household economy can work. And so I don't think, though, this is my argument, and it's not based on this research, but my argument would be something like, let's not look down on the parent that decides to stay at home and take care of children, right?
Definitely.
That part of the solution rather than part of the problem. But it's true that if there are more, especially women, staying home and working, it will affect the household economy.
Income.
And the household economy does affect, educational outcome.
I guess speaking to more intersectionality and gender differences as well, would you say then that the educational system is not maybe easy for the males to be adapted to, or would males find themselves less attracted to being consistent and working hard in the Singaporean context? Because as you mentioned yourself, like males are really heavily overrepresented in the normal tech stream, and do you have some ideas or hypotheses like around why?
We have hypotheses, but we weren't able to test them with our data. And there's two. One that you mentioned is that, that boys mature later than girls.
Okay.
And so by the time 12, right, PSLE comes around, girls tend to be more mature, and then that might translate into focus, right?
Yeah.
The other is that we suspected, we didn't really have much of a smoking gun, but we suspected based on our interviews that some of our interviewees had undiagnosed learning disabilities, like ADHD or dyslexia or something like that, that had never been diagnosed. And there's a lot of debate in the literature, but there are some people who think that ADHD and dyslexia appear more in boys rather than girls. And so either of those could explain the pattern, but we don't have the data to test it. So they're really, requires another study. But there was another interesting finding in terms of gender, that when it came to ITE and selecting a concentration, what you're studying at ITE, girls would tend to study things that ended up being less remunerative. In other words, lower income, baking.
So basically all the things that aren't in STEM fields, I guess.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And so even though it seems like in terms of the entrance exams, there's a gender issue, but it's biased against boys, when it comes to vocational training, there seems to be a different gender bias, and it's biased against girls.
Right.
And whether that's socialization, that girls are socialized to becoming a baker, and guys are socialized into fixing MRT, trains, or that kind of thing, is one question. Or whether it's kind of in the
Personal
ITE
choice
system itself. I don't want to indict ITE because they work really, really hard and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But that is something that really does need to get looked at. It's, yeah, I guess that's one issue. The other is, why do we pay bakers lower than we do mechanics?
Interesting. Okay. Human resource and endowment.
Mm.
Yeah. Could you speak to that?
So Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's the issue of, your parents, and especially it's tied to moms,
Okay.
that around the world, that the mom's level of education is usually tied to the kids' level of education. In
Oh,
other words, how far they get.
right.
And so we tried to see, is there something systematic in Malays that would say that this human resource endowment issue is an issue, right? If the Malays have lower levels of education, are they passing it on to onto your kids? And I was trying to look for the table. I couldn't find the table, but if my memory serves, we also found no, little support for the research, the human resource, hypothesis.
Yeah.
That we actually had some people uh, who had master's degrees, and 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 all of that, but their kids ended up in normal tech, as well.
I
And
see.
then not only in terms of education, but also in terms of their profession. And so if you have, a white collar office professional kind of parent, then would you tend to find kids ending up in those kinds of more in more professional versus more vocational uh, settings.
Right. On to religion and education. Like, like I would be somewhat understanding of the situation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would presume that people would normally think that the more religious the student is, the more time they devote to their religion, to God and stuff like that, the less that they'll be inclined to take,
Yeah,
choices to pursue like educational activities or to advance their career in such
mm,
like that. They will be
yeah.
more simple-minded. So how did that actually fare? Uh, Given the
Simple-minded is
results.
one thing. We mainly were looking at issues of time.
Okay.
And so, for instance, I mean, this might be true for Christian kids as well, right? If you spend a lot of time in Sunday school on the
Yeah.
weekends, or if you're, studying in special classes for the, Quran studies on the weekends,
It takes away
and
from.
other things like that. Yeah, but there is also this issue, this hypothesis about kind of non-material aspiration, right?
Okay.
Be a good believer, be a good, what do you call it? Be a good Muslim, or be a good Christian, or whatever, and the material matters less. And
Yeah.
so whether that has maps onto it, and we found in our sample at least very little uh, evidence of that.
Hmm.
And yeah, and even kids who went to, like, I have a student here at SMU who went to a madrasa, and she read through the report before we published it, and her point was that in the madrasa, at least the one that she went to, the academic standards are extremely high,
Yeah.
very, very high. And so it's just it may be more of a mythology that there could be this trade-off between religious education and what we might call secular education.
Hmm. I see. And could maybe like, okay, so obviously since the sample is pretty biased towards not like normal technical students, but in general, would you think that special assistance schools, the SAPs, which mostly host predominantly Chinese students, would that would obviously increase the inequality as well, because more resources, more opportunities, more connections are given to, like, I guess, middle to high class students, which only further propagates the current situation that we have in Singapore. Would you seem to agree with that, or?
All I can say is that our study doesn't have any bearing on that debate.
Yeah, for
uh,
sure.
yeah, I've seen research on it. The research seems to be persuasive that helps to, what do you call it, uh, continue, encourage the
The gap.
continuation of inequality and all of that kind of stuff. But like you say, we're focused on normal tech students, and so SAP didn't really come into the debate.
Okay, yeah, fair. So I guess one of the questions that I do have is, how do we then sort of tackle this issue and explain and understand like what's going on and why this gap actually exists?
And yeah, we had two questions. And in terms of the first question, which is why are the Malays overrepresented in normal technical, we couldn't answer the question.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating. But there's two or three things that I would say.
Mm,
One is that we couldn't answer the question positively, but we were able to show that our evidence was inconsistent with many of the hypotheses.
right.
So it's a little bit like instead of Sherlock Holmes finding the murderer, he can let some of the suspects go free
Mm,
because he can say that they didn't do it. And so the idea that there's this kind of lack of motivation, lack of aspiration, they're bad at math or other things like that, we found were inconsistent with our data. And it's not like all the Malays we talked to were super focused. No, it's that in when they were young kids, many of them were not super focused, but that was distributed among the Chinese and Malay. But then there's two, so we were able to kind of eliminate some of the factors that are commonly used to understand it. But I think our study has two limitations that don't allow us to decisively weigh in on two different issues. One is, like I was saying earlier, if we had studied wealthier kids, and actually not just normal tech kids, but kids throughout the distribution, we
mm,
would be able to weigh in better on this human resource, not this human resource, but on the family income
yeah.
issue. And for us, what happened was it was clear that income affected that. First of all, Malays had lower income.
Mm,
Second, that income matters.
right.
But for many of our sample, because they receive financial aid, it was able to overcome that barrier,
Yeah.
which doesn't mean that income doesn't matter.
Yeah. It
And I
just
think
speaks to the
because we
importance
were
of financial assistance.
right, and we were focused on a very narrow range of the entire population, both in terms of normal tech and in terms of lower income, we
Yeah.
weren't able to really say, kind of say decisively or more emphatically, that income is what's driving this. But for our study, it was clear that race and income mapped onto each other. But because of financial aid and because there was no correlation between the distribution in the low income range, we couldn't say the lower the income, the worse off the outcome, full stop,
Mm,
because there was a lot of things of other things that ended up being more important, including financial aid, but also many people were able to overcome limitations, like we say with the second question, because they had an encouraging teacher, or they had somebody who really believed in them, or they were hands-on learners, and then when they hit ITE, they got turned on and excited, and so they were able to kind of that the money issues became less important. They were able to overcome some barriers, and then with financial aid, they were able to achieve their dreams.
I see. I guess one question I do have is also, did the report not consider doing sort of, I guess, a multifaceted approach where they were looking at how multiple factors would then lead to the conclusion? Because I've seen it's more singular, where they would test the hypotheses for one factor and then see whether it reaches that, conclusion. What about if we were to test like whether a male um student who comes from a large family size, who was
Mm.
deeply religious, yeah, and all of those things that intertwine could lead to such an outcome? Was that something
Yeah,
that was considered?
and there's sort of two ways to get at this issue, and the because we don't have a random sample, it's difficult to apply some of the statistical tools, but we tried them anyway. And so running regressions, which would allow you to control for a whole bunch of factors to see if a certain factor matters or not. But when we did that, so for instance, if you control for race and gender, does income matter, and all of those kinds of things, it didn't end up mattering. But what you're talking about is different than that. It's not about controlling those factors. It's about the interaction of those factors.
Yeah.
And so it ends up being more like Boolean logic, where you say,
Sorry.
A plus B plus C leads to a certain outcome,
Hmm.
but A plus B and no C does not lead to a certain outcome, right? It's more like
Yeah.
that Boolean logic where,
Yes.
you know what I mean, circles and the overlaps and all of that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
And when we tried to do that, it became so complicated that my
Right.
brain exploded. It was very hard to see, a clear pattern. But
Okay.
what we were able to do, and those are in the tables at the end, which we probably should have put in the beginning, because that's, I think, where the powerful stuff
Right.
is able to identify, in terms of our second question, why did some succeed and some not succeed in terms of achieving their own dreams, that there were 5 different pathways in, right, into the whole, but then 5 different pathways, 5 or 6 different ways out of the whole.
Yeah.
And that's is sort of using a little bit more of your idea, which is what are the combinations of things that actually um, lead to better outcomes. And
Right.
uh, and in almost every case, it was financial aid plus. And so it
Mm.
would be financial aid plus someone who believed in me, financial aid plus um, uh, uh, being inspired and turned on, or financial aid plus institutional flexibility. In other words, ITE, being the sort of the school of last resort and giving people a second chance, and then what our third chance or fourth chance, and then once they came in, there's something about ITE. I think many Singaporeans look down on, but the government really has put in a lot of resources into ITE, but there's also something qualitative about it, where many of the people that we talk to, when they hit ITE, all of a sudden, for those hands-on learners, they were able to thrive.
Mm.
And it's because all of a sudden they were being asked to do something that they weren't, uh, that they were asked to do something that they were actually good at.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That does make a lot of sense. And I do see the feedback that the report has gotten. Some feedback that I've seen that were not so positive about the report was saying that how it was quite negative to kind of compare them to the Chinese race, because it's becoming of the other. It's why should the Malay race kind of adopt the Chinese practices in order to succeed and stuff like that. So what would you say to like people who are commenting those type of things about the report?
Yeah, I have seen some of those comments as well.
Yeah.
And there's something fair about the criticism, and this is what I think is fair, is that Singaporean society is very unforgiving if
Mm.
um, they expect every family to stand on its own 2 feet, and
Yeah.
every kid to work really, really hard, and they'll support you in many ways. But yeah, and that this report sort of buys into that idea.
Yeah, the notion.
Now, that notion, we're very clear, though, in terms of the way that we label success. It's not based, it, whether the adult succeeded or not, we did it based on their own dream and aspiration, rather than on what society would say is a dream or aspiration. We have a discussion about that, the correlation between those two things in the back. And so if they wanted to be a dancer or an artist or a baker or a MRT mechanic, we thought all of that as being equally legitimate as any other kind of aspiration, being an entrepreneur or being, whatever. And so but there's also another issue, which is that if we are going to say that as a society, this is something I can't weigh into as a foreigner and as someone out of the racial group.
Yeah.
But if Malays as a group are going to say, we're just not going to play that game, right? We're not going to play the Chinese game.
Mm.
It's going to require a humongous change in Singapore.
Right.
And the and I don't think whether our report exists or not will affect that ability. And so to change. And so my questions for the critics would be something like, yeah, what we're trying to do is we ended up, based on our data, to be able to disrupt or add to the questions about some of the stereotypes of Malays. And that may not be enough, but what by criticizing the report, what do you accomplish?
Hmm.
Because I think for the critics to get what they envision in society would require something akin to a social revolution,
Yeah,
right? Not a
definitely.
revolution, not a political revolution, but a social revolution, a different way of viewing society. And
Hmm.
that's fair. That's absolutely fair. But I don't think our report existing or not affects that.
Right.
And I think our testing some of the stereotypes doesn't, I would argue, doesn't reinforce the stereotypes because it's there. I mean, part of the issue with one of the issues that Singapore is grappling with is that by putting on OB markers, you're not able to really question some of the attitudes that are out there. And
Hmm.
so what we were trying to do is to say, are we able to take a more methodical look at some of the questions that we really haven't studied much?
Yeah,
And
there's
there's
been
more
no
and more
research on
research.
this actually, so
Yeah.
you're
I
right.
think there's more and more research on it, but we really were trying to trying to contribute to that.
Hmm.
And that's what I didn't see in the critics is kind of how is that is by is by testing that hypothesis and rejecting it, they were sort of saying, well, why are you even talking about it at
Yeah,
all?
exactly.
And I didn't understand that. I think part of the problem is, and AMP felt like part of the problem was, and REMA felt like part of the problem was that we weren't talking about it
Hmm.
at all. And so we should talk about it. And they might say, well, that's obviously not true. You don't need a scientific study. But I think to much of society, including Malay society, there's a
Yeah,
lot of people who buy into these stereotypes.
yeah.
And that, I'm not sure our report by itself you know, will make a big enough difference. But
Hmm.
um, I certainly don't see
It
how
will
it
harm.
reinforces that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I guess like what one of the things that you mentioned at the start of the interview was also, why is there such a gap that exists since the independence of Singapore. And I would say for myself and many people who have also read the report would argue that actually it's begun way long time ago, like the Malays have been colonized by Europeans and lastly by the British, and that seemed to have a major blow in terms of their education, how the British used to set up schools and how it impacted the Malays and how they were segregated and basically treated like second-class citizens in their own country, how they were kind of displaced in the economic workforce by Chinese and Indian immigrants, things like that. So would you agree that there seems to be quite a significant historical factor, i.e. colonization and the discriminatory laws that have been brought about by certain government policies that may or may not have been intended to do so, um, that playing a role in today's inequality in income and education per se?
And we discussed that debate in the report, right? That the typical thing that because you can't subjugate a population based on guns for long, right? You can't force people to cooperate by force for long. And so the typical one of the tools that colonizers would use would be to divide and conquer. And it would be to privilege one racial group and say that they're superior to another, and then
Yeah,
use them and give them enough benefits that they're willing to be co-opted into, helping you rule.
yeah.
And then when Singapore was established in 1965, it made an explicit decision, and I think that decision is understandable given the context that we're not going to do what we in America would call affirmative action.
Mm,
That people point to Malaysia, and part of the problems with that Malaysia is happening is because there's special treatment for certain racial groups that are intended to equalize, but end up creating unintended consequences.
Yeah.
But one of the consequences of that is that that it's difficult, even though the Malays have made a lot of progress, a huge amount of progress on many different levels, including income growth, including educational outcomes and other things like that. They're not catching up. It's like the Chinese are also making strides, and that level of inequality, not a big enough dent. But that was the second limitation that I was going to mention to our research, which is that in terms of studying racism, it's very hard. We didn't explicitly ask people, were you racially discriminated against? Because it would be like leading the witness or something like that. But we did have a handful of people who could point to racist and many more sexist kinds of incidents that happened to them. But it wasn't like there was a smoking gun. Our study really is just simply not set up to say there's systematic societal or institutional racism in Singapore, and that's what's causing this gap. And so really our report is blind to both making a substantial contribution on this class question, as well as making a substantial contribution in terms of whether there's some kind of racial structure within Singapore that's perpetuating this.
Yeah.
And guilty as charged in terms of that. Not every study can do everything.
Definitely.
We were able to document some, issues that have to do with race, but in terms of kind of systematic racism, our report really is neutral on it. It doesn't really weigh in on that debate.
I see. Okay. I would say maybe coming back to that point about how, they've not really breached the gap with the Chinese. I would say it could be because of, when they were being displaced in the economy, and when the British, did not sort of integrate them into the educational schools that they were set up, and left the Malays to their own religious schools that were there during the colonization period and stuff. They did not really equip them with the necessary technical knowledge and education for the capitalist system that would be running in the globalized world for the decades that were to come. And obviously with the Chinese and Indians coming up here, setting up shop, being very much more entrepreneurial than the Malays, that would have to be a stark wealth accumulation gap. Hence why it's not a Malay and Indian issue. It only seems to be a Malay issue. If you compare quite across the board, it seems that Indians are faring quite well as well. Actually similar or earning even more than the Chinese counterparts. So what are your thoughts on sort of the analysis?
That's that sort of a historical analysis of the historical roots of where we are today, and why there aren't many policies to help close that gap. It really has been debated in academic circles, and I think that's been a very positive thing. Our research doesn't really weigh in on that. You can't use our data to weigh in on one side or the other, but we are able to kind of eliminate some of the other suspects. And so, or at least not eliminate, but our data is inconsistent with these factors as being contributing to the education gap, the racially based education gap. And so it really needs to continue, like a more fine-tuned research in terms of institutions and societal attitudes that may be contributing to that problem.
Right. And just really last quick question then. What does the future hold for you, Professor John? Are you looking into doing more research for RIMA? Are you looking at other areas of poverty in Singapore? Because I do know that's what your work is based around mostly.
Well, actually, my main research is focused on rural poverty in China.
Right.
And so that's been my bread and butter. 80% of my research really, but because I'm living here in Singapore, I got very curious about it. And with the Lian Center of Social Innovation here at SMU, they were looking at unmet social needs and other kinds of urban issues. So I got involved with them, running a couple of classes looking at single parent households, which we have done some publishing on, looking at we have a report coming out on food security, household-based food security. In other words, people who may not be hungry but don't know where their next meal is coming from here in Singapore and what contributes to that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's been very exciting.
Awesome. Okay, but thank you so much for taking the time. I'm going to have like a second look at the report and maybe email you some other thoughts that I may have that might come up. But you have been great throughout the whole interview, and I
Well, thank you,
really wish you
Lucas.
all the best.
Thank you for your interest and really great questions. And I appreciate your approaching me. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care now.
Take care.